Welcome back! Let's talk about DR3. Danganronpa 3 is a show split into two separate shows that ran at the same time as one another. These two shows are the Future Arc and the Despair Arc. The Future Arc is the most recent in the DR timeline, while the Despair Arc is a flashback arc for pre-tragedy Hope's Peak. Future centers around the DR1 cast plus the Future Foundation, while Despair centers around the DR2 cast on top of some new characters Future introduces. Each show ran on two different time slots per week. On Tuesdays you'd get a Future Arc episode, and then on the Thursday of that same week you would get a Despair Arc episode. In theory, Future would give you plot progression first, then the Despair Arc would give you context for that progression 2 days later. The Future Arc takes place in a second killing game put on by what seems to be a traitor in the Future Foundation. The premise of the game is that each contestant is trapped in this confined space until these bracelets on their arms puts them to sleep. While they're asleep, a traitor among them will wake up and kill one of them. The game ends when the traitor fails to kill someone during this sleep cycle. To make things more complicated, each bracelet on the contestant's arm has a special rule for the player that they cannot break or else they die. And from here on out, I'm going to call these the forbidden actions. Other players can force each other to break these rules and kill each other as a result. So it becomes this information game where you have to conceal as much as necessary to figure out who the real murderer in the group is. Meanwhile, in the Despair Arc, we get the series of events that led Hajime to becoming Izuru Kamakura. This is primarily a retelling of the events that led to Danganronpa 0 and a bit of what we learned about Danganronpa 2's cast in their respective game. It's mostly a mix of important plot details for series-spanning events, context for Future Arc plot moments, and just general slice-of-life moments with the fan-favorite DR2 characters. Sounds pretty straightforward, right? Well, I wish, okay? But it's not. Danganronpa 3 is an extremely complex and subversive show that tries to use its back and forth plot structure between its two halves to deliver this big overarching message. But because we're so many layers deep at this point, what should have been a simple message becomes very difficult to understand due to how this show goes about presenting it. The way I see it, there are two layers of difficulty you have to get through to understand Danganronpa 3. First of all, you need to be able to pick apart what pieces of information it tells you are actually important and which are not. The plot of the Future Arc, which is built around finding the traitor / mastermind of the killing game, has scenes that are dense with these really complicated meta-criticisms about the series as a whole that will then be sidelined by characters acting outside of this dense symbolism because they're trying to survive to the next episode. This can sometimes result in good chunks of episodes dedicated to people hiding or just walking around aimlessly trying to figure out what's going on for good portions of most of this series. The Despair Arc is no different in this sense. It wants to show you the events that led to the tragedy, all while expanding on some really old themes we talked about in earlier videos. But sometimes it just won't do that. Sometimes you'll get these slices of life segments I mentioned, or flashbacks to characters just messing around in Hope's Peak to distract you from these mind-bogglingly important scenes that come out of scenic nowhere. Other times, it'll layer a ton of symbolism in scenes that are broken apart and drawn out by B-plots to episodes that go on for way longer than they need to, and they basically just overtake the shit that actually matters in this message it's trying to deliver to us. To fully understand what Danganronpa 3 is actually saying, you have to parse through these episodes of raw white noise while juggling tons of different themes at the same time. But even when you do all that, you also have to figure out which relevant parts belong to which message. See, the second layer of difficulty comes from the weird way Danganronpa 3 not only divides itself into two separate anime, but it also divides itself into two different messages that are generally about the same thing. You have the first message, which is this very literal, surface level storyline directly told to us with each episode, and then there's this roundabout, insane, symbolic meta-narrative going on in the background. Both of these messages take place at the exact same time as one another, but are presented differently based on which point is trying to get across. Sometimes a character will talk and there will just be this double meaning to everything they say. And then other times they'll talk and then there just won't be. You just have to figure out which one is which if you want to keep track of everything. It's all very confusing, but thankfully I did all the hard work for you. I have gone through this entire set of 24 episodes and I have compiled what I think this message is all about. I'm going to divide this this video into 3 parts. First, I'm going to explain what I think the surface level, hard to miss message the show wants to tell us is. Then, I'm going to go one layer deeper and dive into the crazy symbolism beneath the surface of everything going on. And finally, I'm going to finish off by stating what my opinion on everything is. You know, the actual review part that I really wanted to get to had it not been for these earlier things, but you know what? We'll get there when we get there. So with all that out of the way, let's get started. I'm so sorry, but I gotta stop us just this once to give a quick summary of all the major players that I'm gonna be talking about throughout this show. I don't really feel like giving you their full backstory, so I'm just gonna put it here and then we'll move on. It'll be fast, don't worry. Alright, let's start with all the new characters that spawn into DR3. All of them come from the future arc, thankfully. First, we have Chisa, the ultimate maid, Kyosuke, the ultimate student council president, and Juzo, the ultimate boxer. These 3 were all friends at Hope's Peak. Kyosuke was the leader and he was expected by them to lead the world into the future. He is also the vice chairman of the Future Foundation. The current chairman is a guy named Dangan. He was a former director at Hope's Peak Academy, which made him loosely associated with the Azuru Kamakura project. He also worked alongside Kyoko's dad and another new OC for DR3 named Koichi. Koichi was the former ultimate talent scout for Hope's Peak Academy. In the present day, he's a director for the Future Foundation for the 3rd branch. Don't worry about what the branches are, just know that they exist and everyone else in this organization is the head of one of them. Next, we have Ruruka, the ultimate confectionery, Izayoi, the ultimate blacksmith, and Saiko, the ultimate pharmacist. Ruruka is dating Izayoi and is a former friend of Saiko. They basically had this nasty falling out with each other years ago, and as fate would have it, they're all stuck together on the same organization. Lastly, we have Ryota, the ultimate animator. Like his talent implies, he is an animator who likes working on specifically anime. He is also secretly a part of the original DR2 cast, but wasn't in that game for plot reasons that we'll get into. Finally, we have 2 other characters that only matter insofar as that I'm gonna mention them by name at least once. We have Miyaya Gekogahara, the ultimate therapist, and Daisaku Bandai, the ultimate farmer. And that's it. That's all the summary I got. It's gamer time now. Let's do this for real. Danganronpa 3 is about beating the depression that comes with loneliness. The Future and Despair arc serve to make a case for this problem, and the Hope arc provides the solution to it. In the Future arc, the killing game the characters are trapped in pretty much exists to make statements about how difficult it is for people to connect with one another. The fact it revolves around discovering a traitor builds it up in such a way where the most optimal plays you can make are ones that have to do with distance. The game can only end if the culprit fails to kill someone, meaning that as long as no one is close to one another before the next killing phase happens, they're guaranteed to win. It's built off a meta where the traitor has to make sure they're never alone at all times, meaning the act of human connection will almost always end with you making a bad move. Trusting people is dangerous. On top of all this, we have the forbidden actions the players are given. These actions are, first of all, valuable for predicting other players' movements if you know what they are, and second of all, they're a metaphor for our own flaws as people. They're a part of each player that makes them vulnerable if shared. These rules aren't inherently known to everyone else, and there's a huge deal of power in them not knowing, since it means you're less predictable to the traitor when you're their next target. We're also introduced to a set of crumbling relationships throughout the show. Kyosuke's entire arc is focused around the fall of his friendship with Juzo and the maid. The game corrupts him to the point of almost killing everyone in the name of finding the traitor, all while being unable to accept that he and everyone else he was close to ended up being part of the problem when it ends up getting revealed near the end of the series. In episodes 3 and 4, we see him use Naegi as bait for the true culprit after fighting the cast to get to him. Then in episodes 5 and 6, he realizes that everyone was the quote-unquote traitor and the maid betrayed him. Finally, in episode 9, he tries to kill his right-hand man, Juzo. His existence for this portion of the show is just to burn bridges with everyone around him because the killing game demands it. Another good example of these toxic relationships highlighted by the game is the one between the blacksmith, Ruruka, and Psycho. Ruruka is basically a manipulative psycho bitch who doesn't trust anyone, leading to her taking advantage of Psycho's loneliness throughout their childhood until they eventually went their separate ways. The blacksmith is basically her boyfriend, who's loyal to her no matter what. Eventually, every single party I just mentioned ends up dying, so their entire feud was basically for nothing. This three-way CBT is meant to portray a one-sided relationship between the three of them. Despite being together, they're actually all apart because they were all simply using the other to feel validated. The blacksmith's love for Ruruka was one-sided and fell apart as soon as his forbidden rule was that he couldn't eat her confectionaries. From that point onward, she no longer trusted him. This was the same reason she also had for not trusting Psycho. We learned somewhere in the early part of the series that Psycho has an allergy that prevents her from actually eating the confectionaries that she makes. And in multiple scenes, we actually see that this is a huge problem for Ruruka. Her sense of trust is violated because her sweets can't be eaten, which ultimately culminates in her not only betraying Psycho when they were younger, but also betraying her own boyfriend when she ends up killing him by forcing him to eat sweets and break his forbidden action. As for Psycho, she was lonely before meeting Ruruka and let herself get taken advantage of because she wanted the validation that Ruruka gave her. She found someone who valued her in a way that she wasn't before and clung on to that feeling, even though, as we end up finding later throughout the series, the value that Ruruka got from her was completely situational, which is clearly shown in episode 4 of the Despair arc, where there's an entire subplot about how Psycho gets used to help Ruruka and her boyfriend cheat on one of the most important exams in all of Hope's Peak. Then at the end, when things don't go their way and they end up getting caught, they have this huge fight, as if their friendship never mattered in the first place. Besides these crumbling relationships, the future arc also focuses on this idea of forgiveness. Kyosuke has to be honest about his feelings for the maid in order for his character arc to come to a close when he talks to Naegi in episode 10. He has to accept the fact that the maid betrayed him and move on from that. Kyoko has a character arc that runs alongside the main storyline, where she's encouraged by Koichi to be honest about her feelings for both Naegi and her father. She has to drop the hate she has for him in order to accept other people into her life. And it's through Koichi that he sort of becomes this stand-in for her father's kindness that stands in the way of this idea that he abandoned her when she was young. The Despair arc, on the other hand, continues this dissection of loneliness using talent as a substitute for people's identities. It isn't as concerned with crumbling relationships as much as it is the circumstances that push people away from one another and isolating themselves. This concept of someone in DR's universe figuratively being their talent is nothing we haven't seen before. Danganronpa 0 brought out this idea multiple times, so I won't rehash everything here, but I'll just give you a quick summary so we're all on the same page. In Danganronpa, being talented means your entire future is set for you. Your job at Hope's Peak is to strengthen your talent enough to where you can do it for the rest of your life. It defines your value as a person in this story to society around you. The after effects of a system like this are what we get more of in Danganronpa 3's Despair arc. The best example of this can be found in this series' take on Twilight Syndrome murder case, which we get to see take place in episode 3. The main players in this are Hajime, Natsume, Fuyuhiko's sister, and Sato, Mahiru's childhood friend. Each one has a problem in relation to talent. Natsume is in the reserve course and feels like she's living in her brother's shadow. She's all alone because he has talent and she doesn't. Sato is obsessed with Mahiru because she's talented and destined to achieve greatness with her pictures. Because they're both in the same photo club, it's implied that Sato is trying to vicariously live through Mahiru's success. This is evidenced when she says that Mahiru is the hope for the photography club. Finally, Hajime feels inadequate compared to Chiaki, who he's been hanging out with since episode 2, because of not only this divide in talent, but also this feeling of living in her shadow. They both play games together and he can't seem to beat her. He's just not as good, and it's a constant reminder that she is considered objectively better than him by the standards of this society they live in. Each character experiences feelings of isolation as a result of their interpretations of talent. Issues Natsume faces aren't just born from the way she's being treated by the school. They're born from how she understands the consequences of not being on equal footing with her brother. Sato is an even more interesting case. We actually see that she's content, in a way, being in the position she's in, as long as she can exist in relation to someone who is above her. To her, there is no inherent problem with her current social standing. She doesn't see herself as an individual, rather, she includes herself as part of this group, the photography club. Mahiru succeeding in her eyes means she can succeed by association. Between both girls, we have characters who are caught in a system where their existence gains and loses value based on how they understand their role in it. This makes it even more impactful that, later in episode 3, after observing both characters' demise, when Sato kills Natsume and then subsequently gets killed off herself, Hajime ends up deciding to become Izuru Kamakura. This is important because prior to all these events taking place, the show goes out of its way in episode 2 to establish that this distinction is arbitrary. There are two conversations that push this message forward. First is one between Chiaki and the maid, where she directly says that relationships are more important than talent, and another is between Tengen and Hajime, where he tells him it's okay to be a quote-unquote normal person. Chiaki thinks that her talent won't allow her to connect with anyone. She thinks that her being a based gamer prevents anyone from ever reaching her level or relating to her in some way. It's only when she tries to use her talent as a stepping stone to bring her other classmates together that she starts to form genuine bonds with other people. Talent as a concept is an optional determinant of your future that can only work if you choose to buy into the implications of having or not having it. Ryota is a character who wants to use his talent as the ultimate animator to make a hope anime that'll save the world. To do so, he teams up with the ultimate imposter so he can make the anime while the imposter assumes his identity at school. He literally gives up his existence to someone else in order to focus on his talent. If we break down his dynamic with the imposter, things get a lot more complicated. The imposter, as a character, is the living embodiment of his talent. By refusing to be himself, he is acting how the world wants him to. He must assume the forms of other people. He cannot exist in order for the world DR has established to acknowledge him as being someone who matters. Ryota and he both show us that talent doesn't just distance us from one another, it also distances us from ourselves. This is even more significant when you realize that this hope anime Ryota gave up everything to make is what ended up dooming the world when Junko hijacks it and makes an evil version of it to convince people to do her bidding. All of this paints this picture for us of a world where loneliness is derived from the attempts of people in society trying to live up to its expectations. They struggle to assume these roles, arbitrarily cut out for them, and then crumble as a result. Both of these arcs culminate in the final episode of the anime, titled the Hope Arc, where this anime comes back and takes center stage again. For context, it's stated by Ryota that his anime uses subliminal messages in order to convince people to feel certain emotions. This has a sort of brainwashing effect that Junko ends up seeing and using for herself, which ends up becoming relevant later because in the Hope arc, Ryota tries to use his actual Hope anime with the subliminal messages to essentially brainwash people into never feeling despair or any negative emotion ever again. The scene that I'm going to focus on here in this episode is near the end, when Hajime and all the other DR2 students, who after escaping the DR2 simulation, head over to the Future Arc's Killing Game location and have a standoff with Ryota right as he's about to broadcast his Hope video to essentially the entire world. And if that sentence sounded like a mouthful of random garbage, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, that is literally what happens. They basically tell Ryota in this scene that it's okay to feel sad and all these negative emotions because they allow people to come together to work through them. Only experiencing hope would also push people away in the same way that Junko's despair video did. This moment is important because, like Killer Killer, it rejects this idea of the hope versus despair dynamic we've seen throughout the series, but in a more literal sense. The central conflict of this show is loneliness and the feelings that come with it. Ryota is trying to fix this with the Hope anime. What the DR2 cast is saying is that negative emotions and this isolation he's feeling is normal. The solution isn't to eliminate it, it's to live with it. In both the Future and Despair arcs, characters do a bunch of shitty things to each other that drive everyone apart. What the Hope arc says is that the crucial piece missing here from this division between people is 1, the forgiveness that comes with accepting everyone's flaws that we learn in the Future arc, and 2, our willingness as people to open up and share our interests with other people, as shown through the Despair arc. All in all, it's just your average, basic bitch, friendship is magic story told through Danganronpa. It's nothing you haven't seen before. Now, let's talk about the real shit. Danganronpa 3 is a hyper-advanced version of what Killer Killer did that's even more complicated because it doesn't just have the luxury of being a spin-off. While Killer Killer was about shedding the label of Danganronpa to become something new, Danganronpa 3 can't do that. It literally is Danganronpa. This anime is weird because while everything does wrap up in one final conclusion at the end of the series, the path it takes to get there is littered with a ton of disjointed ideas that mostly point toward the same thing. At its heart, this anime wants to end the Junko storyline. In the process of doing so, we get insights into the show's insecurities about its starting point, a cynical view on its writing, and a resolution to this cynicism with the show's ending. In between these points, we get a series of character studies and events that are meant to illustrate different sides of this multi-layered problem the show is trying to address here. But before we can get into all that, we have to understand the basis by which all these criticisms come from. And in order to do that, we have to once again go back to Danganronpa 1. So for the last time, I'm going to talk about this game and all its themes. Danganronpa 1 is a very radical story about a group of characters confronting the society they live in and the systems within it. Everyone in the Killing Game composes a society Monokuma creates that's meant to showcase all the flaws that are present outside the school itself. His world for the Killing Game is a stand-in for our world. As such, there are huge implications to every action each player takes. Succumbing to the Killing Game and murdering another student proves that society hasn't changed. It's just as corrupt inside the school as it is outside. When Leon kills Sayaka, a huge deal is made out of his motivations for breaking down the door and stabbing her, even though it wasn't necessary to survive. It's important that her death was needless because it was something Leon actively chose to do to put the other cast members at risk. If people are willing to tear each other apart in times of crisis, then as it stands, whether or not these kids survive this game is meaningless. How could the world reform itself if nothing changes? Naegi is the opposing side to this. When he stood up and claimed that the reason Leon chose to kill was because of Monokuma, he was directly indicting the system he's living in rather than the individual. They're living in artificial conditions where they're more predisposed to destroying themselves, brought on by their own pseudo-government. We see this through Monokuma's increasing involvement in each case. He goes from casually pushing the game forward by influencing students to kill each other in case 1 to outright forging evidence in case 4 for the sake of complicating the trial. Cases 5 and 6 are the apex of this because everything hits this point where he is just cheating and needs to be called out in order for the game to be fair. In doing so, Naegi and the gang inadvertently questioned the entire philosophy behind this world he spent the last 4 cases building. As soon as the system was revealed to be rigged, the students were able to uproot it and rebuild it properly this time. Symbolically, when this is done, a statement is being made about the systems we live in. DR1 is making the accusation here that the world we're in predisposes us to fucking each other over. The only solution it shows us is to rise up and replace it. On top of all of this, the entire Killing Game was broadcast. Within the context of Danganronpa 1, it was shown over the world's television networks, but symbolically it was being shown to us. This argument about society was being presented to us players, and we had to determine how true it actually was. All of these things I just brought up tie directly into Danganronpa 3. In this anime, a huge emphasis is placed on this broadcast of Danganronpa 1, and how it influenced those who saw the kids triumph over Junko. This is something we learned from Kyosuke in episode 3 of the Future arc. Danganronpa 1 existed as a piece of media within the canon of this story that was consumed by the outside world. In other words, in Danganronpa 3, DR as we understand it actually exists. The consequences of this are going to form the backbone of what this anime is going to end up building to. But that's just the first half of the context we need before we begin to understand anything. The bare bones setup for this anime is that there exists a piece of media in universe that represents a real life piece of media in our universe, that being DR1. To get the second half of all this, we have to look at a very important conversation Kyosuke and Naegi have about this new version of the killing game they're trapped in, which goes from episodes 3 to episode 4. At this point, Kyosuke is trying to root out the traitor by gambling with every other member's lives, and Naegi is pushing for everyone to cooperate instead of backstabbing each other. What ensues is a criticism of this position that goes a lot deeper than just deconstructing Naigi's viewpoint at face value. Instead, what Kyosuke does is provide a criticism of Danganronpa 1 and the rest of Danganronpa as it exists as a piece of art. Naigi's perspective is that the same thing he did in DR1, where he relied on his friends to help him overcome the game, is valid in the DR3 killing game. Kyosuke's argument is that Naigi's perspective is warped by the DR1 killing game. That game provided the world with a scenario that does not reflect reality. It lives in this state of idealism, where the villain is clearly defined and a system exists to properly punish her. As soon as the evil is wiped out, the survivors who are assumed to be better than the villain they took down are tasked with leading everyone else into the future. The stakes for DR1 were essentially play or die, or don't play and live. When someone broke the rules, an all-seeing fair governing body would step in and put a stop to it. People on the outside don't have the same luxury afforded to these students of not playing or having a third party step in because something is unfair. Because that video game was literally taking place in an in-universe game, Kyosuke invalidates the value its messaging has due to it being essentially a work of fiction. To some extent, he's not entirely wrong when he says Naigi's situation was not indicative of reality. It should go without saying, but you can't really out corruption by relying on the same corruption to essentially resolve itself. In Danganronpa 3, to Kyosuke, applying Naigi's methodology from the first game to his reality would mean expecting the system to somehow fix itself, which just isn't practical. Remember, Danganronpa 1 was a critique of society. By arguing that the mechanisms by which society was portrayed through the game are unrealistic, Kyosuke is questioning the very metaphors themselves and how legitimate they actually were. By extension, we're being asked to criticize this piece of media in the real world as well for how good it was at conveying its messaging. So that's it. Naegi is our Danganronpa 1 stand-in, and his role in this show is to prove to Kyosuke, and by extension us, that his respective game had value as a work of art. Okay, you have all the context. Let's get to the actual point I want to make with all of this. Danganronpa 3 is once again a story about the Danganronpa franchise as a whole finding closure within itself and moving on. It does this in this extremely high concept way that I'm gonna go over as I try to explain it to you. Let's start by talking about the despair arc. The despair arc is probably the most thematically dense part of this show. While it's meant to be a flashback to how the world fell into despair, it's also a commentary on this series' confused identity. It does this in some really odd ways, the weirdest of which is with its characters. Characters in this show are metaphorically broken down into their existences as people trying to move the story forward. Twilight Syndrome Murder Case is probably one of the craziest examples of this. When you look at the arcs of its major players, Hajime, Sato, and Natsume, you see a common problem where they're all struggling to obtain some kind of value in Danganronpa's world. But what does this mean exactly? When the inadequacy of Hajime and the others is pointed out to us, it's always in relation to main characters in this franchise. Hajime feels worthless when compared to Chiaki. Natsume feels worthless when compared to her brother. Finally, Sato attempts to gain value by associating with Mahiru. The problem they face isn't just that they have no place in the world. The problem is really that they have no place in Danganronpa. They cannot be a part of the main cast in the main school, meaning they cannot accept their existence in this work of fiction as background characters. The only reason Hajime ends up sticking around in this story is because he obtains talent and becomes Izuru Kamakura, making him an official part of the main cast. It's from Twilight Syndrome Murder Case that our view of talent is contextualized around more than just being interpretable cogs in DR's universe. Instead, talent is about being worthy enough to become those cogs in the first place. It grants you the ability to matter in the overarching narrative. These characters are blank slates who are arbitrarily chosen as mattering to what will become Danganronpa. Our first step to understanding how this anime talks about storytelling is to view the people we see in this arc as malleable characters. Storytelling ultimately comes down to how the viewer understands it, and having the characters struggle with this individually is the precursor to what will become the problem the Despair arc is trying to show us. The students who have talent suffer from a different set of problems than the talentless ones we just talked about. If the talentless suffer from being characters with no value to be interpreted, then the talented are those who have no value because they've already been interpreted for us. The life of an ultimate is one determined by the school. They are characters who aren't seen as anything other than what their gift is. This type of predetermined characterization is shown to be a bad thing through Ryota, the imposter, and Chiaki. Ryota and the imposter live on extremes, where their dynamic is such that they cannot exist as actual people in Danganronpa until the in-universe Hope anime is made. This is shown to be a bad thing, as Ryota not only almost dies from doing this, but his original anime also causes the conflict of the main series. Meanwhile, when you look back at Chiaki's problem I covered earlier, its solution is to go beyond her talent so she can actually relate to people. These characters are all the same. Their talents, or lack thereof, prevent them from being complete characters. This is the plight of all students that we went over in DR0, reserve or otherwise. You can also see this struggle with identity that the students have through Hope's Peak itself. Hope's Peak, in a way, is the truest self-insert for Danganronpa that this series has ever had. It functions like a piece of art, in that its interpretation varies based on who interacts with it. Kyosuke, Juzo, and Chisa see it as corrupt and want to reform it in their image. The steering committee sees it as this research center to create the ultimate talented students, and to the outside world, it's this beacon of hope that'll save the world somehow. It's constantly flowing through these different states, and people are constantly trying to fight for control over the narrative surrounding it, which is all really significant because all of these traits that surround the strangeness with how the world and everyone in it sees this school are embodied by Izuru Kamakura, the character. Izuru Kamakura is the name of the school's founder, and it's also the name Hajime ends up getting when he gets every single talent in the entire world, which is really bizarre as a setup because it makes Hajime this stand-in for the school itself in a way. He is this representative of its core values. But in a sense, he's also not, because he's only representative of the values of the steering committee. Their values are at odds with how everyone else thinks this school should operate, which is important to understand because that's why when Izuru Kamakura is officially born into the world, he's a character with no motivations and no values. Like the school, he is this blank slate of interpretation that everyone throws their values onto. He only exists for other people. Like all the other characters, he portrays this lack of freedom. He has no sense of direction, which by extension also applies to the school because he is a stand-in for it. And it's with that that I can make the much bigger argument that in the same way that the students represent characters in this story on a more metaphorical sense, Hope's Peak and Izuru Kamakura expand on that in such a way where they represent Danganronpa as a whole. Izuru even has Monokuma's color scheme, where the red and black are the two main colors of his evil form, while his character is mostly white in his good form. He functions as the embodiment of the struggle for every single ultimate and non-ultimate in this series. He isn't just defined by one talent, he has all of them. Therefore, he basically is everything and nothing at the same time. And by extension, that means that Danganronpa is also directionless. It's also devoid of meaning because it can be everything and anything at one time. The entire world of Danganronpa 3's Despair arc is said to be a metaphor for itself as a series. This is chronologically the starting point of everything. This is what takes place before every single event and every single piece of Danganronpa media we've gone through so far actually begins. And it's from this that we actually jumpstart the core conflict we've gone over in previous videos. That being, what does hope versus despair actually represent as a theme? Danganronpa Another Episode and Killer Killer both paint this conflict as narratively substanceless. It's an endless battle that doesn't progress the story and needs to be abandoned. Kamaru's arc in Another Episode is defined by her artificial growth as a character, and her story ends when she vows to not resolve the outstanding issues she was involved in. She refuses to take a side in this endless battle at the end of her own game. In Killer Killer, Takumi and Misaki both choose to literally abandon the DR universe while also concluding their own story as this resolution to hope versus despair. Their arc is them transcending the limitations imposed on their world by this plot device. In both stories, while acting as yet another good versus evil framework, hope versus despair clearly transcends its literal presence in the story with its two factions and becomes something representative of this series' identity. Characters who choose not to be a part of it promptly end their respective titles because the narrative has no more use for them anymore. In Danganronpa 3, we pretty much see the same thing we've seen in another episode and Killer Killer, but in a more unique way. Because the Despair arc is a meta-narrative on storytelling as a whole, using Danganronpa as a base, we actually get to see Hope vs. Despair in an even more abstract sense than we have before. While we once had to view it as this vague part of Danganronpa's story that we want to move away from, here we actually get a pretty impassioned argument on why it needed to exist in the first place. Junko Enoshima is the one who provides us the clearest case for why this plot device has to exist. Junko is another character in Danganronpa 3 that becomes someone completely new because of the overarching meta-narrative going on around her. In episode 6, she has this conversation with Izuru about the predictability of the world and why despair needs to exist. Her main argument is that a world of hope is pre-existing harmony. She says that Izuru would be reinforcing the status quo by becoming what the steering committee wants him to be, which would be boring and played out. The reason this is significant is because her argument has a lot more weight to it when you combine it with what we've gone over so far. The world the Despair arc shows us is, from her perspective, one of stagnation. It lacks conflict as characters within it have bought into this cycle of interpretation I outlined earlier. When Juku complains that Izuru following the path of hope would make the world stagnant, we know that that would be true because we literally witnessed it happening right in front of us for several episodes. We've seen what happens when students break under pressure and how the school covers it up with Twilight Syndrome murder case. We've seen the complacency of talented students accepting their roles in society the school wants for them. We've seen the reluctant complacency of the Reserve Corps students who fall in line with the school's outlook of them. This system was designed to perpetuate itself, and it's only after Junko enters the story that the setting can start to actually matter. Significant events happen in DR's world like Izuru's creation, but without Junko's interference, he really is just an aimless tool. Her instigating the fall of Hope's Peak and starting the Hope versus Despair conflict was in service of starting a narrative that would not have existed otherwise. Now, Danganronpa is no longer a world devoid of all meaning. Characters' actions within the story now have severe consequences for either side. As long as this conflict exists, these characters have meaning. This story has meaning, and Danganronpa has meaning. Hope versus Despair isn't just a worthless plot device here. Instead, it's the springboard by which characters can actualize themselves. Because the endless battle can go on, villains can be made for heroes to take down. Adversity can be created and conquered. Value can be added to the journey of any character that is forced to participate in it. Hope versus Despair is the pure embodiment of meaning in storytelling. What the Despair arc does is present us with Danganronpa's reason for existing. It exists to tell a good and evil story so its characters and world can become relevant through the legacy they leave behind. We get this picture of Danganronpa as this series which artificially continues itself in an attempt to give meaning to its characters. Going back to Kyosuke's criticisms of Danganronpa 1, we can actually see this pop up when he calls out the fact that the game Naegi and the gang was in was, in fact, a game. It was an experience designed to make them heroes, but the overall message that could be gained from it was hollow because it was part of this recurring system. The future arc Killing Game is, in his eyes, the sense of reality that was missing from Naegi's past experiences. And it's with that we can finally move to talking about the other half of this series. The future arc is a lot less complicated than the Despair arc, but it does act as the second half of DR3, where the outstanding conflicts Despair brought up get expanded on and addressed. While Despair was concerned with presenting to us the state of Danganronpa's existence as a franchise and its reason for being, Future cares a lot about, coincidentally, its future. It does this in, of course, the most batshit insane way I've ever seen, by completely deconstructing Makoto Naegi as a character and everything he stood for in every conceivable way. A common theme you'll see throughout this arc is the concept of figureheads. Ultimates in the world of Danganronpa have this deified status as being the forefront of the world's progress. When that image gets ruined by Junko, Naegi ends up taking its place. He's described as being this inspiration to everyone around him, to where multiple characters have to remind him just how important he is to the world. Most of the future arc is even dedicated to preventing Naegi's death, to the point where Kyoko actually ends up having to sacrifice herself for him to even keep going. The entire Killing Game, aka the show, revolves around this one character. Naegi is what the Ultimates used to be before the apocalypse hit. As a result, the show paints this oddly cynical picture of Danganronpa while trying to legitimize his legacy in-universe. On its face, what this constant reminder about Naegi's importance does for us seemingly provides a counterpoint to Kyosuke's initial arguments in episode 3. Despite the circumstances of Danganronpa 1 being confined to a game, the impact it left on the world was demonstrably real. People related to the struggle Naegi went through in that killing game and chose to follow him. However, this whole aspect of Naegi feeds into the darker side of this part of his character. Functionally speaking, the world of Danganronpa is replacing a collection of great individuals with one person and his organization. The Ultimates represented unattainable perfection that sits at the top of society. What Naegi represents is something similar, but with a positive spin to it. Naegi is the everyman. He sells you on the premise that you don't have to be special to overcome obstacles in the same way he does. The problem is that now this dynamic has shifted from the talented versus the untalented to those who can versus those who can't measure up to Naegi's willpower. He is the new standard people strive for. Not being an ultimate meant that you were valueless to the world. With Naegi, not being able to have his willpower means you fall into despair. In other words, you become the enemy of the world instead. The division that led the world to destroy itself is slowly being recreated with a new coat of paint here. Even though Naegi, and by extension Danganronpa 1, provided a hopeful story of overcoming adversity, not everyone can reasonably do that. This, ironically, makes this entire attempt at subverting Kyosuke's message do the exact opposite because it demonstrates just how out of touch Danganronpa 1 actually was from the problems it was trying to address. This is because Danganronpa 1's legacy is now one of creating the very enemies it seeks to destroy within its own universe. In fact, I'll go one step further. Danganronpa 1's messaging isn't just called out and then left in the dust with Kyosuke's arguments. It is actually systematically disproven using the crumbling relationships of the other characters, because if you trace through their backstories, each one of them was attempting to be Naegi and failed. The reason the concept of Naegi's hopefulness is said to not work is because we have an organization of potential Naegis that could not make it work. Let's go back to those relationships I talked about in an earlier section of this video and break them down using this idea as our starting point. Kyosuke is the head of the Future Foundation. He was treated like Naegi by both the maid and Juzo. He was the one that was supposed to save the world in their eyes. And to that end, they both stuck by him. The problem was that he wasn't able to live up to the image of him that they had in their heads. The mindset Naegi and his friends had could not translate over to him. As a result, everything went haywire and they lost their way as soon as someone in their group was revealed to be secretly evil. You're only as strong as your weakest link. The entire concept of this killing game is to demonstrate that, which is why it's built entirely around the concept of a traitor. Someone, somehow, didn't buy into the hope message, and it's costing everyone everything. In the original Danganronpa 1 killing game, someone betraying everyone else would make them the Blackened. You would have a class trial and then execute them, purging society of the traitor. In the real world, these characters inhabit, that just isn't true. The system doesn't always work, and in fact, the apocalypse is a direct result of it not working. For Naegi's message to be true, there had to be this secondary system that applied fairness to every argument he made. This information also helps us understand the dynamic with Saiko and Rurika. The entire mini-arc between those two characters was just a warped version of how the characters treat Naegi throughout this story. Rurika operates in a world of her being the leader with her friends as her subordinates. People do things for her because they want to, and she takes advantage of that. Naegi was everyone's hope. Characters had to believe in him and what he stood for in order for them to get anywhere. Rurika turns this on its head by portraying this belief in Naegi as a sort of unhealthy codependency. Her entire existence is based solely on how competent the people she surrounds herself with are. When the killing game starts, she can only survive as long as the blacksmith is alive. Once she kills him off in episode 9, she's powerless. This situation would be the exact same if someone in Naegi's group fell apart too, if we just base everything off of Danganronpa 1. In fact, the idea that people even died at all in that killing game illustrates this perfectly. They didn't believe that they could survive as a class, so they decided to bet everyone's lives against theirs. To really round off this point, I want to bring attention to the fact that the show even makes a point of how Naegi couldn't even live up to his own standards. When the traitor is revealed to just be the characters committing suicide due to a brainwashing video in episode 11, Naegi almost becomes its last victim. Juzo has to step in and save him because he couldn't overcome it himself. By condemning figureheads in this way through the future arc's deconstruction of Naegi, Danganronpa 3 attempts to give us a lens by which to view itself. It's trying to guide our interpretation of ongoing conflict presented to us in the Despair arc by demystifying the heroes who participate in it. It's really important that the Future Foundation is the main cast for this anime, because they are, based on everything we've seen so far, the good guys of Danganronpa at this point. The fact they can fall into this endless conflict too, alongside the protagonist of the first game, gives us a new viewpoint into Hope vs. Despair and how it failed the series as a narrative device. While it did provide meaning that was lacking, as we talked about earlier, it did so in such a way that was disconnected from reality. The audience who consumed Danganronpa, aka the Future Foundation, which, by extension is us, cannot and did not get anything worthwhile out of this series that erects and disposes of Boogeyman with each title. The Future arc exposes this failure of the series over the course of 11 episodes before it finally brings everything to a close in what it calls the Hope arc. Throughout this review, I've gone over multiple pieces of media in Danganronpa's universe and how they ended up betraying the characters in different ways. I've talked about the aimlessness of the series being solved by introducing a villain in the form of Junko, and through Kyosuke, the many flaws that came with that. So it's only fitting that the ending of Danganronpa 3 is about rejecting escapism in media. Ryota is someone who grew up with anime. It's all he knows, and it's all he's dedicated his life to. The final conflict of the show is him trying to expose everyone to this anime so he can eliminate all negative emotions. When he's confronted about this by the DR2 cast, they aren't just trying to convince him that hope and despair must coexist and that friendship is important. No, they're rejecting the very nature of escapist fantasy in media. They're telling Ryota that he can't keep turning to anime. He has to face reality. The story they've been in isn't real. Kyosuke was right. Their experiences had value. The games and the books we've read did matter, but if you only ever experience reality through them, you haven't learned anything. This anime has shown us the rise and fall of this series and how it struggled to convey its messaging to its audience. Now, it's come to terms with its existence as media. Danganronpa is a story about coming together as people to overcome the hardships that society throws at us. It makes the case that we live in a world filled with tons of anxieties that we all share, and it's only by being vulnerable with each other that we can overcome these obstacles. And now it's encouraging its audience through the DR2 cast to go out and practice what it preaches, learning from the experiences captured by its creators. When all the characters are finally out on the famous Danganronpa ending boat, they aren't just leaving the series like we've seen so many times before. They're telling you, the viewer, that the lived experiences portrayed through media are not as valuable as the lived experiences you'll get in the real world. The characters who, in Danganronpa, left the digital world to come into reality are now asking you to do the same. Now go outside, you fucking incels. True Danganronpa message, touch grass. The end. Okay. That's all the analysis I have in me. So, what do I think of all this? What is my review in this review series that I wanted to give before all this dumb bullshit I had to go over came up? Well, here we go. At the end of the Despair arc, when all the students are converted into evil fucked up versions of the hamburger helper guy, Junko and Izuru Kamakura have a conversation on the roof about memes. They talk about this idea that their influence will spread because Hope's Peak, the face of society, has fallen. Ideas and how people share them through the internet and TV will change the world. This is the culmination of everything we've talked about. It's the point at which the show makes the statement, media is a powerful tool that can influence the world outside of it. What this also functions as is the peak of the smoke and mirrors routine this show has put up since episode 1. It's the point at which the entire meta-narrative that's been going on this whole time completely falls apart. Junko Enoshima, a character who has existed to make boob jokes, got shoved into a rape contract and has died on 2 different different occasions, is talking to Izuru Kamakura, a non-character who has barely been in this series up until this point, about memes. I don't always upend society, but you know what made Killer Killer work? It's the fact it was sincere. Sure, it was crazy. Sure, it was gory. But none of it was ever tongue-in-cheek. When a character could do something supernatural, that was presented as being just as normal as everything else. The fact it played it so straight made it so much fun to read. Danganronpa, the main series, it ain't that. It is not a sincere story. It's very clearly a franchise geared at a very specific demographic of teenagers that wants to be cool without actually committing to anything. It's filled with fan service of these underage characters and constant remarks about how cliche and trite the story is. The world these characters exist in has the depth of a game show. In Killer Killer, Misaki had a clear investment in what was going on, because not only was her life on the line, but the credibility of her partner was constantly being called into question, because it was possible he was the most wanted serial killer in their area. But the characters in every other Danganronpa we've looked at do not give a solitary shit about the story behind the world they're in. DR1 is built entirely around the characters finding out the mystery behind the game, not the world, and it has to be this big thing at the end because nobody was looking into it up until now. Dear Zero stars a main lead who only cares about finding one guy she likes. Everything else she finds out comes from off screen, and she doesn't even give a shit about the information she gets. The DR2 cast had to be forced by Monokuma to even consider thinking about the outside world. Hell, they even got put into a situation where they were being starved to death before they could even begin to consider leaving the game. Kumaru Naegi is actually just a cardboard cutout in another episode that awkwardly walks around to different locations, being utterly confused about what's happening at all times. At no point does she ever have a single solitary thought in her mind that goes, yeah, this kid sure is evil, I wonder how that factors into the tragedy at Hope's Peak. Even the cast of villains comes from a completely made up part of Hope's Peak Academy that never comes up again. This franchise does not give a fuck about its own lore. It doesn't want its characters to care, and by extension, I don't care. So when I see Danganronpa 3 come in, and it tries to tell me the fate of the world is decided by an anime, like the thing I'm watching, I start asking some questions. When the show asking me to contemplate the way we're affected by the things we watch is the same show that has a scene where all the characters try to have sex with each other after drinking a sex drug, I start to raise an eyebrow. When the same show that's asking me to look at these characters in a metaphorical lens has a scene where a misunderstanding causes a dog to become 50 feet tall while a committee of judges get cramps from drinking laxatives, I start to have some opinions. When the show asking me to think about my relationships with other people has a scene where one of these good friends becomes the Hulk for no reason and fights the same two characters for like 3 episodes, I start to have some thoughts. When the show asking me to really appreciate the experiences of its characters, to grasp at the message underneath, ends a main antagonist storyline by not having some thematic end to her character, but instead having her give up and fly into space to become, and I quote, a space neat, well, now I'm not so sure. The entire message hidden between the lines of this show is nothing more than a hasty way to end a series that's been famous for shitting out cliffhanger after cliffhanger. It's a lame conclusion to an already lame series that did not care in the first place. Danganronpa 3 is fucking dog shit. It's a stupid waste of time in a series that set itself up for failure. It's filled to the brim with redundant information that was already explained in other parts of the series that becomes fucking unbearable to sit through because of how goddamn long it is. There was absolutely no reason this show needed to be 24 episodes long, spread across 2 different series. The despair arc should not exist. If you look past like 4 scenes that matter, it is actually unwatchable bullshit. The themes about talent and the corruption of Hope's Peak were already established in Danganronpa 0 and Danganronpa 2. It centers around a cast of characters that is probably the most fleshed out in this series. Izuru Kamakura and Hajime's character arc about not being special and Junko Enoshima's motivations were both things that were explored to death in the other Danganronpas. All pointless here. The Despair arc exists to insert the new Future Foundation characters into this timeline, and that's it. The story is so well established at this point that they cannot impact the lore in any significant way. New plot elements have to be made up and jammed into this story to justify the existence of this long bullshit flashback. How did Junko take over the world? Did she use the corruption from the school like we were told this whole time? Yes, but you missed something. It turns out she also had the power of this anime this random fucking guy made. Where was this ever stated? At any other point before this? Well, I'm stating it right now, bitch. Anime is the future. Juzo is a security guard that works for the school. He almost catches Junko in episode 10, but gives up when she blackmails him. It turns out he's gay for Kyosuke. When Junko says she'll reveal that if he tries to stop her, he just gives up. The world died because this one guy wouldn't come out of the closet. Just amazing lore once again. All my questions have been answered. Chisa being the homeroom teacher, this random asshole being Kyoko's dad's right-hand man, the imposter being Ryota. All of this only serves to answer questions that only the Future arc has brought up. The real point of this show, where it hits peak stupid, is the big reveal that Chiaki was a real student who was alive, a character from DR2 who almost said something about how we relate to fictional characters in media was actually fucking real. Nothing ever happens. There's even an entire episode dedicated to just watching Junko kill her in the first execution. Everyone's favorite character TM gets to die for no fucking reason, so all the characters lose hope and become evil. Nothing in the Despair arc matters. This show sucks balls. The Future arc, while also bad, is only better by virtue of it being fucking hilarious at times. Everything about the killing game for this part of the show is amazing for all the wrong reasons. It's designed to be beaten in like 2 seconds. If everyone just locks themselves in separate rooms, they win. It's not even a contest. There aren't any forbidden actions that 100% stop this, making them even funnier than they already are. They're just these unnecessary, inconsequential risk factors introduced into the game that make no difference whatsoever. As soon as they got introduced in episode 2, I knew they'd be the stuff of legends. Here's how this sequence plays out. Daisaku Bandai has the forbidden action of viewing violence, meaning if he sees violence at all, he'll die. Okay, shouldn't be too bad, right? Oh, how wrong you are. You see, this killing game is a battle of wits that even our main squeeze Daisaku couldn't have accounted for. In the same episode where these rules are introduced, he makes a fatal miscalculation that causes him to break his own rule. This one oversight completely undoes him. He exists in the same space as Juzo. So because Juzo is a dumb fucking gorilla, he randomly blames Naegi for the killing game on no basis and just decides to beat the shit out of him. And because Daisaku saw this ass kicking, oops, guess he's dead. Sorry, better luck next time. Look at his face in this shot when he's putting his hand on Juzo. It just says everything. Like this was the easiest rule to not break, and here he is suffering for no reason. Rest in peace, King. You will be missed. Each time a new rule gets revealed, it becomes my favorite. Wheelchair Girl has a rule where she can't turn right. Yeah, like turning right as in the direction. Just fuck you, I guess. Kyoko's rule is that Naegi has to die by the 4th round of the game, which is hilarious because this should be really easy if everyone wasn't so dumb, but sadly they are, so she just dies. Naegi isn't allowed to run. How does this prevent you from locking yourself in a room? I don't know. Get wrecked, I guess. Gotta get your steps in. Psycho can't let people step in her shadow because, yeah, you just can't. Don't do that. Don't walk. No one can step all over me anymore. Ah, the symbolism. They're the most stupidly inconvenient restrictions of all time to place on people. I love them. You honestly just had to be there when these episodes were first airing, and it started to dawn on people that Kyosuke had a rule where he can't open doors. There were scenes where he was just breaking down walls, and people were just going like, wait, no, it can't be. And then it finally got revealed, and oh, this is the mystery I came here for. One other thing that makes this killing game great for the wrong reasons, and you've probably already realized this by now, but like no one really gives a shit about solving this game, right? Like I'm pretty sure they care in universe, but if you step back and look at how they act throughout the show, they play like people who clearly don't give a shit. Flashback to episode 2 again. There's this scene after Daisaku's death where, for some reason, Kyosuke blames Naegi for the killing game, so he repeatedly tells him to kill himself. No, seriously.
Makoto Naegi, what lines are you willing to cross to stand on the side of hope? Show us. Do the honorable thing and commit suicide.
And Naigi's like, no, I'm not gonna do that. The rest of the show becomes Naegi trying to stop this unstable psychopathic idiot from murdering everyone because he doesn't want to use his brain. The fact the game is such an afterthought to everyone until the very end killed any possible intrigue all the flashbacks would have. The entire dynamic of these characters and all their themes didn't need to exist if they were just smarter. This show is a complete waste of time. Nothing hurts more than seeing nonsense happen in the future arc, no plot progression, and then having that followed up with a nothing episode from the Despair arc. Nothing mattered in this series. Danganronpa 3 has dedicated itself to systematically destroying every possible avenue of interest that might happen. Rurika's storyline is lame. I have no context for who this character was before this show, so it's not like I have any ongoing questions that she answers. She just kind of shows up and dies. Kyoko rehashes her character arc from like literally everything before this by learning to be more open with people, which only exists so this random asshole that got retconned into this series has a purpose. Finally, Monica, this character from another episode who escaped on a cliffhanger, came back just so that she could fly into space because Lord knows they ran out of ideas at this point. It really does cement that another episode could have been replaced with a block of cheese and it wouldn't have made a difference.
Top of the morning to ya!
What's going on? What are you planning?
What everyone in your position says. Now pay close attention.
Dude, this car kicks ass, and I can watch
Danganronpa
while I'm driving.
What kind of music do you like, Gloria?
Despair! I really don't have anything more to say about Danganronpa 3. It's a very boring show filled with a lot of padding that fails on every level to keep me interested in what's going on. Honestly, the fact that I was able to even get as much out of it as I did for the earlier analysis is this show's saving grace. Because if all that wasn't there, this video would be like 5 minutes long. It's funny looking back at this anime after all these years because it was the original reason why I made Dangan Chronicles in the first place. When I first saw it, it kinda blew my mind. The show looked like a massive joke to me, and I figured that I must be missing something. There must be some satire that went over my head. By going back and trying to see if you could argue that everything was a joke, what I found was the depressing realization that no, Danganronpa wasn't always a joke, it just became one over time. This show is so fucking dumb in every possible way. It's funny at just how soulless Danganronpa really is. If there's one thing I've learned from these videos, and I'm gonna be honest, Kodake is just a massive fucking hack who constantly exploits this very specific teenage demographic looking for something edgy to watch. If someone's gonna do some high concept meta narrative thing right, it sure as hell isn't gonna be this guy. I kind of feel bad for the fans at this point because like there's no way that this anime really appealed to them like it was trying to. Danganronpa 3 sucks, and honestly so does the rest of this series. And with that, I think the perfect way to end this video is with one of my favorite scenes from this anime. At some point they decide to show us the big despair incident that caused all of Danganronpa. And what better of a way to end a video than to end us off where it all began. But before I forget, should you take Danganronpa 3 seriously? No. Now hang tight while I spend another 7 billion years before I actually review the game that shall not be named. Goodbye.